You got it back here. Right now.
Okay, thank you. I am in the process of writing a book on entitled The Clash of Economic Ideas. And the theme of it is the big economic debates of the last 100 years, the big economic experiments of the last 100 years, and how economists have contributed or tried to interpret these kind of events. So I've tried to extract from it something about the economic history of the 20th century. Because I think it's helpful when especially when you're talking about the history of economic thought about policy issues, to set them in the context of the debates that are actually happening and the issues that are actually animating people who are writing about these things. So very often the history of economic thought is taught in a very disembodied way as a series of dueling blackboards. But actually people were arguing about real issues. There are a couple of themes that run through the work, and one is, what is the role of intellectuals in social change? And here's Hayek's view as expressed in The Intellectuals and Socialism, that intellectuals have some influence. Their ideas are what matter in the long run. They influence the politics of tomorrow, and what looks like a battle of interests has often been previously debated among intellectuals. And so, I mean, the implied advice is, if you want to change social policy, you need to change the ideas of intellectuals. Keynes said something very similar. This famous quote that economists love to quote because it makes them sound important. Right? Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually the slaves of some defunct economist.
Here we are.
I think it's truer than we would like. Right? So Keynes himself has risen from the dead in the recent debate over the financial crisis. But the view that Hayek and Keynes are expressing can be thought of by analogy with the structure of production. It's kind of a view that there's an intellectual structure of production. There are those who operate at the earliest stage, developing theories at a more abstract level, economic theories in particular. There are those who apply these theories to explaining current events, putting out position papers and mass market paperbacks, let's say. So at the theoretical level, the research is published for other theorists, for other academics. You have academic journals publishing this kind of research. Applied research you find in the Cato Journal, Independent Review, various white papers and monographs. And the hope is that the ideas will be picked up then by journalists, promulgated in op-ed pieces, and so on. But of course, even high theorists occasionally will come down the structure and try to make popular versions of their own arguments. So we'll talk about the road to serfdom later as Hayek's attempt to write for a broader audience. And then, if an idea is successful, it may find its way into policy. So you can think of the public and the policymakers as kind of the ultimate consumers for which these ideas are moving through the stages of production. This is not the only way to think about the influence of intellectuals. Here's an alternative view that the Italian economist Pareto offered, a somewhat more cynical view in his book Mind and Society, that, look, let's be honest, it is a clash among economic interests. Ideas and theories are just sort of fig leaves that these interests use. And if you want to know what academic views are being promoted, it's the ones that are convenient to the people in power or the people who have the money to pay for them. So really, the academic theorists are not a leading indicator, they're a lagging indicator. They'll adopt the theories that are convenient to those in power. Now, I think there's a germ of truth of this. We can think of examples of intellectuals who have sort of catered to those who are already in power. And I think that there certainly can be cases where the ideas are really just surface froth. But I don't see any reason a priori to think that one view or the other is correct all the time. So it becomes a matter of getting down to cases and asking, in particular cases, were the theorists who didn't really have any axe to grind being influential, or were they just providing a fig leaf for policies that had already been determined on other grounds? Okay, so what's the state of the debate at the beginning of the 20th century? Here's our friend Paul Krugman. Right? And until Keynes published a general theory, economics was completely dominated by free market orthodoxy. Heresies would occasionally pop up, but they were always suppressed. Would that it were so. Here Krugman is repeating a myth that Keynes himself promulgated. Keynes had this practice of saying that, referring to all economists before himself as classical economists and lumping them all together and claiming they all had one view and that he, Keynes, was the iconoclast. But it's just not true, and we'll see how there's long been a clash of economic ideas. I offered the contrast yesterday between the state theory of money and the market theory of money. There have long been those who have believed that the state needs to intervene, that markets fail to accomplish good results. Although, economics is the first place where the market theory takes hold, where people come to realize and elaborate why and how society regulates itself. So economists have sort of acquired this reputation for being people, all of whom believe in laissez-faire as a policy measure. And it's probably true even today that on your college campus, the economists are less to the left than the rest of the faculty. Nonetheless, the median economist is to the left of the center of the American public's views. People have done serious studies on party registration among economists, Dan Klein in particular, and found that economists who are members of the American Economic Association are about 3-to-1 Democrats over Republicans. Now, this compares to sociology and history, where it's 20, 30, 50-to-1, but it's still 3-to-1, using that as sort of a rough indicator where we actually have some numbers. So it's not true today that economists are all laissez-faire, and it wasn't true back then either. And let me give you some evidence. The sort of two leading economists in the first decade of the 20th century were Alfred Marshall in England, right? You've heard his name before here, the developer of supply and demand analysis. The other I'm going to refer to is Irving Fisher in the United States. But Marshall gives a speech in 1907 talking about the state of the economics profession and its views on policy. He talks about John Stuart Mill and how over his career Mill became more and more favorable toward government. His father was a hardcore laissez-fairist, James Mill, but John Stuart Mill became more and more inclined to think that government could solve problems for society. And Marshall says, well, Mill was responding to changes in the objective technology that governments have now for doing good things. So technical progress has enlarged the scope for the beneficial intervention of government since Mill's death, even more than during his life. So we're learning that government now has many new, large, and subtle resources for finding out where it can do more harm than good. Right? So he's a progressive, and we'll see that Irving Fisher is too. And there are two particular arguments that Marshall advances. One, building on John Stuart Mill, a kind of utilitarian case for redistribution, based on a kind of Benthamite interpretation of utility theory. He says, look, I think the way he puts it is, the seventh course of the plutocrat's dinner provides less pleasure than taking the same resources and providing milk to poor children. Right? So that's a utilitarian case for some aggregate of society's happiness being increased by redistributing resources. And the second thing Marshall develops is the externality theory, right? The idea that there are spillovers that the market doesn't capture, and that this is a failure of the market as opposed to, say, a failure to enforce property rights. Marshall's student and disciple, A.C. Pigou, develops this notion of externality and market failure. So this is coming from economists, right? They are not promoting laissez-faire. And Irving Fisher is in many ways, gives a speech in the same year, 1907, is more explicit about this. He said, look, we've left all that behind. In modern economics, we no longer believe in the extreme laissez-faire doctrines of the classical economists. We now have modern doctrines of government regulation and social control. Right? So he's applauding this transformation of economics as he sees it, and says, look, there are two problems with laissez-faire. People aren't well informed about their own interests. Fisher himself favored prohibition of alcohol. This was considered a progressive view because, you know, it was like cleaning the streets. It was a public health measure. In fact, Fisher uses this analogy in his talk. He says, we don't let people spit in the streets anymore. We shouldn't let them pollute their bodies with alcohol. They just don't realize how bad it is for them. Taking it a little farther, he was in favor of eugenics, right? Sterilize the idiots. Not exactly a laissez-faire or classical liberal view. And then Fisher also embraced this notion of externalities, actions in which the injury to society outweighs the benefit to the individual. So he says, I'm not a socialist, but we need to steer a prudent course. We also don't want to be, you know, extreme individualists. So that's pretty much the state of the debate in the first decade of the 20th century. Progressivism has its adherents among economists, and a lot of the regulations on the market in the first part of the 20th century are endorsed by economists. It's not that economists are all laissez-faire preventing it. And, you know, in a way you shouldn't be surprised by this. Economists, the classical economists, developed arguments against government intervention. People who are in favor of government intervention, if they see classical economics as having any traction, they can learn the language too. And they could figure out how to twist the doctrines of economics into arguments for government intervention. And they have. So here's a piece, some more evidence that Krugman has it wrong, right? When he says that the heretics were relegated to the fringes of the profession and their ideas were suppressed. Richard T. Ely, leading economist in the first decade of the 20th century, he's a progressive, writes several books with the word socialist in the title, although he claimed he wasn't quite a socialist. He's a member of the generation where there weren't yet PhD programs in economics in the U.S., so people who wanted to teach economics went to Germany. And in Germany, the German Historical School, right, the opponents of Karl Menger, were teaching socialism of a kind of Bismarckian sort, that is, the social welfare state, cradle-to-grave welfare from the government. He's trained in that tradition. He brings these ideas back to the U.S. He has students who study under him at the University of Wisconsin who take these ideas to other schools. But he is one of the main founders of the American Economics Association. And he founds the American Economic Association modeled on the Verein für Sozialpolitik, which was the organization of the German Historical School, right? An organization which was devoted to promoting progressive socialist policies in Germany. And if you read the statement of doctrine of the first meeting of the American Economics Association, it's the same thing. Right? We're coming together to show that economics is not a laissez-faire doctrine. We want to combat that idea. Subsequently, the AEA was taken over by people who really didn't have any ideas but just wanted to promote their professional advancement. And so the principles of the organization were rewritten in later years. But if you look at the founding of the AEA, it's all about promoting social reform. A guy named Fred Taylor, who is elected president of the AEA in 1928, is another example of non-laissez-faire ideas hardly being suppressed or relegated to the fringes. He's the president of the AEA, the Professional Association of Economists, and his presidential address is on using prices to steer a socialist economy. So he's one of the early proponents of market socialism, which I'll say more about in a minute. Well, socialism comes to the United States in the First World War. Under Wilson, the government commandeers resources for the war effort. That is, they don't buy them at market prices, they commandeer them. There's a lot of direct planning and allocating and rationing. And this becomes the precedent for New Deal programs under FDR. And in Rothbard's America's Great Depression, he documents all the links. Many of the people who are appointed by Wilson to administer resources in World War I get their jobs back in the New Deal. After the war, the federal government shrinks, not quite back to as small as it had been before the war. There's a kind of ratchet effect as described by Robert Higgs in Crisis in Leviathan. Chapter 7 is the chapter that deals with the First World War. But there was a campaign, Warren Harding talked about a return to normalcy, which meant a return to the market mechanism as a way of allocating resources. Same thing happens in Great Britain. The government expands enormously during the war, shrinks afterward, but not quite back to the level it had been before. And we'll see this pattern repeated, as Higgs describes. In a crisis, Leviathan grows. When the crisis passes, people seem to have become desensitized to an expanded role for the government, and they're willing to tolerate more than they were before. Well, an important economic policy experiment is the Bolshevik Revolution. So what I just went through was the first chapter of the book. This is the second chapter. And I think it's important to, in a sense, start the discussion of economics with the socialist calculation debate, because that's where we get a grasp of what it is that markets do for us and how it is that markets actually work in more detail than simple blackboard theories had given us up to that point. So there are actually two Russian revolutions. Right? Lenin doesn't throw out the Tsar. Lenin throws out the democratic government, which had replaced the Tsar when he abdicated. So the Bolsheviks, kind of to everyone's surprise, find themselves in power. Now what are they going to do? And how are they going to run the economy? Their objective is to follow the ideas of Marx, right? But Marx doesn't give them any blueprint for planning the economy. In fact, Marx ridiculed socialists who believed in actually trying their ideas out, right? Actually forming a collective farm, say, and trying to implement the principle of each according to his ability, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. He called them utopians, right? So Marx said, what I'm providing is scientific socialism. And if you think about it, it's a little strange, the use of language. Scientific socialism meant we disregard experiments. We just make proclamations. So what are these proclamations? Well, abolition of private property, right? That's principle number one. Okay, what do you replace it with? There's no second sentence to explain the theory of the communists. There's a suggestion that production will be concentrated in the hands of a vast association of the whole nation. So you're going to have a committee of many millions of people. Yeah, you're going to need a big room and a big table. In Capital, Marx says production is to be regulated by men in accordance with a settled plan. Okay, could you tell us a little more about how this plan is going to be formed? How exactly is the nation going to plan production? Well, we know what the Bolsheviks tried to do, right? So they nationalized, it's more or less in the order these measures came. They nationalized the banks. They first nationalized the large firms, turned them over to committees of workers. The state took control of all foreign trade. Then they started nationalizing smaller and smaller businesses. They even outlawed private trade. They outlawed private hiring of labor. They outlawed private leasing of land. They even tried to do away with money. And probably most disastrously, they started just commandeering farm output for distribution in the cities. And the results, as you might expect, were disaster. Sorry, time to take my pills again. Leon Trotsky, who broke with Lenin, of course, has this beautiful description. Each factory resembled a telephone whose wires had been cut. Right? There's no price system communicating to factories what they ought to be producing and what resources they ought to be using to produce what it is they're trying to produce. The output of the economy drops to less than a fifth of what it had been in 1916. Now, Lenin, of course, wants to blame all this on the fact that there's a civil war going on, and that's undoubtedly part of it, but it's not the whole story. And even after the last of the White Russians had been suppressed, they continued with these measures. So later, when Lenin backtracked in 1921, he said, oh, well, that was war communism. That was just an emergency measure. No, that really was the principle he was trying to put into practice. But he was forced by mass starvations, and the cities were just depopulated. The population of St. Petersburg and Moscow fell to less than half of what it had been because people were starving in the city. They were so hungry, they just moved out to the countryside, figuring there's a better chance of getting some food there. When they start confiscating farm produce to ship it to the city, how do you think the farmers respond? Well, they start growing less, and what they do grow, they become better and better at hiding. All right? So there was more food in the countryside than there was in the cities. People moved out, and people are bartering their furniture. So farmers have really good furniture from that era. They got the best furniture from the city in exchange for the food they had in hiding. But in the new economic policy, Lenin has to readmit some market forces to prevent even more people from starving. Communist ideas were not limited to Russia. There's a Hungarian Soviet Republic that's instituted. It only lasts a few months before the army intervenes. It takes back the country. Same thing happens in Bavaria. You go to Marxist.org, you can read the complete works of Lenin, including a letter he sent to the Bavarian socialists. Congratulations on your victory. Have you nationalized the banks yet? Have you taken the property of the rich and given it to the proletarian? Because that's the way you'll consolidate your support. That one lasted really only a month. But even where there weren't outright Bolsheviks taking power, they were influencing policy. In Austria, there's a coalition government which is led by the Social Democrats, who are not the farthest left party, but they are socialists. They appoint a socialization committee which calls for the nationalization of the big industries, headed by a guy named Otto Bauer, who Mises knew personally. He had studied at the University of Vienna. He had actually been a member of Mises' circle, his seminar. And so these ideas are coming home to Mises, right? It's not just something that's happening way off in Russia that Mises is concerned about. It's happening in Vienna. In Vienna, they build this housing project, which the city government calls the Karl Marx Hof, right? The Karl Marx House is the city-owned housing project. It's not nearly as ugly as later city-owned housing projects. I think it actually has a certain amount of style. So you've heard about the socialist calculation debate already this week. Mises writes his famous article and follow-up book. And just to recap the basic point, he said, look, the socialists haven't addressed the basic problem of how do you decide the methods of production. Let's spot them, just for the sake of argument. Let's spot them that they could have a market for consumer goods. right? They could have socialist department stores where people get to choose what it is they want to consume, what they want to buy, and that the producers will take feedback from what sells and what doesn't sell. And suppose you do know, just for the sake of argument, the mix of consumer goods you're aiming at, you still don't know how to produce them, what methods of production you're going to use. There are lots of different recipes for combining inputs to make any given output. If you can't calculate profit and loss, you're at sea without a compass. You don't know what the most economical methods of production are. Well, Mises' argument is directed most immediately at socialists who hadn't basically conceded that there was a problem of scarcity. They were almost completely illiterate in economics. But there were other socialists who recognized that there was a role for dealing with scarcity, and they tried to provide an answer, and that's the socialist calculation debate. But if we kind of boil Mises down to a nutshell, is that mixing my metaphor there? Try to fit the argument into a nutshell. This is from the 1920 article, where there's no free market, there's no pricing mechanism. Without a pricing mechanism, there's no economic calculation. Well, the market socialists say, okay, we'll grant you the second sentence. We need a pricing mechanism. But we won't grant you that you need a free market to have a pricing mechanism. We can have government planners provide the prices that are needed to steer the economy. So this is Oscar Lange. Says it's easy. Walras taught us that what a market does is solve a system of equations. Implicitly. So implicitly and rather crudely, in fact. We're going to solve it explicitly. So we just write out all the equations in the way that Walras taught us, and then we solve them. And we tell the managers, minimize costs for your given level of output. Right? Set your output at where it minimizes average cost. Right? We see the cost curves on the blackboard. Go out and do that. Hayek says, wait a minute. You're assuming that all the information we need about the most economical way to produce things is given. But it's not given to anybody. It's something we have to discover through the struggle of competition. Some people have one idea about an economical way to produce things. Other factory owners have a different idea. We need to let them compete to find out which one is actually going to work, which one is more profitable. We don't know that starting out, right? So this is the argument in the use of knowledge in society, right? Society's problem is not one of solving equations given all the information. The problem is getting the information. It's eliciting the information from thousands of people who have different conjectures and different bits of information specific to where they are and when they're operating. The knowledge of the man on the spot. A German economist named Walter Eucken offered what I think is a nice analogy. He said, Lange's system is that there's going to be a kind of pseudo-bidding. There's going to be an auction where the owners of one state-owned, the managers of one state-owned factory are bidding against the managers of another state-owned factory. He said that's like trying to play bridge against yourself. Right? It's not a real competition. So the famous lesson of Hayek's use of knowledge in society, the famous example of how a free market solves this problem of finding the most economical way to produce things under changing circumstances, is this example of a tin mine. So here's a tin mine. Suppose it collapses. Now there's not enough tin to go around. We got to cut back on some uses of tin. How is it decided which uses should be cut back? Well, the socialist method would be, the central planning method would be, go out and survey all the users of tin, ask them to list their uses, and then we go through the list and decide which ones to strike out. Well, Hayek says, look, the miracle of the price system is you don't have to do that. Instead, let the price of tin rise, right? Because supply is now falling short of demand at the old price. Let the price of tin rise, and as it rises, everybody who's a tin user will start to say, wow, it's more expensive to make my roofing out of tin. Maybe I should think about aluminum. What are the uses of tin for which I have the readiest substitutes? And so without any central direction, without any orders being sent out from the center, only the least valuable uses of tin are being cut back. Right? And the decisions are being made by thousands and thousands of users who themselves are judging which are the least valuable uses of tin, and they know better than anybody which substitutes are appropriate for the uses they have been using the tin for. So there's a guy with tin snips cutting out the tin. Here's an amusing footnote. Lange is just an academic economist born in Poland but educated in the West, and is teaching at the University of Chicago when Poland becomes a communist country after the war, right, becomes a Soviet satellite. Lange decides to do his patriotic duty and moves back to Poland, and since he's a world-renowned economist, he becomes chairman of the Polish Economic Council. So now he's in a position to implement market socialism, right? Yeah, but he doesn't. He looks at the situation and says, no, I guess we need to use the Stalinist model of just giving factories quotas and allocating inputs to them. He didn't try to institute this quasi-bidding by managers, simulated profit accounting, or adjusting prices to at the center to try to eliminate shortages. He adopts the straightforward sort of Stalinist methods. And throughout the Soviet bloc, same story. So it seems like, to me, that this is a practical refutation of market socialism. Right? Even when its advocate is in a position of power, he can't implement it. It's not really a serious plan. Okay, back to the West. So that was Chapter 2. Chapter 3 is the Roaring Twenties and Austrian business cycle theory. You've heard a lot about Austrian business cycle theory, but let me tell you a little about the Roaring Twenties. So here's a plot of real GDP per capita. And you can see there's a recession in 1921. It's actually a pretty sharp one, and the economy falls pretty sharply, but it rebounds pretty sharply too. The recession is very short-lived, and the reason basically is the federal government's policy is to do nothing. Right? To let prices and wages adjust. And there's a high rate of unemployment, but a very short-lived period of high unemployment. The economy rebounds pretty well. But then there's this period that we call the Roaring Twenties, and it's represented here by output being above the long-run path. And the Federal Reserve System, which was founded in, the Act is passed in 1913, it's up and running in 1914, and starts kind of experimenting with its new powers in the 20s. The Fed has something to do with this period of false prosperity, this period which doesn't last. So you can see there the sharp downturn in 1929. We'll talk later about the big trough that follows. That's the Great Depression. All right, but here's some numbers. Real GDP is up 45% over these 8 years between the recovery of 1921 and the crash of 1929, which is growth of 4.79% a year, much higher than the 20th century average of a little over 3%. And this is a fact which, at the time, economists struggled to explain or recognize as something that needed explanation. Modern-day economists have completely neglected it as a stylized fact which business cycle theory has to explain, and that is the expansion is not in all lines of business proportionately, it's top-heavy. And the book by Phillips, McManus, and Nelson on banking in the business cycle, which is now available online on the Mises.org site, emphasizes this. They gather some statistics to illustrate the applicability of the Austrian theory. Right? The early stages of production are being expanded disproportionately. Pig iron and steel production is up. Construction activity is way up. Industrial production is up much more than output of consumer goods. Right? So the triangle is getting longer. But there's almost no price inflation. So if your criterion for whether monetary policy is on the right track is only to look at the price level, you're going to miss this. And this is a mistake we've repeated, right? The Fed thought in the 1990s 90s that everything was fine. Well, in the early part of this decade, everything was fine because inflation wasn't out of hand, completely ignoring asset prices and ignoring the top heaviness in the construction industry. So here's some data from the 1920s on industrial production index. And I guess I should draw a trend line through that, but here's the recession in 1921. And after that, the economy recovers, and recovers above the long-run trend. And you can see that there's a beginning of a recession in 1927, and it's shaded by the NBER, so that's how you can tell it's a recession. But that's when the Fed really begins to flex its muscles and says, oh, we don't want to let this happen. We don't want the boom to come to an end. And that's when they really start cranking up easy credit. And they succeed in, if you want to call it success, driving industrial production back up, and of course driving stock prices back up until it all comes horribly undone. So the boom gives way to a bust, the downturn begins, the Fed cheapens money to try to extend it, the money supply grows even faster, the stock market booms, and then the Fed begins to get alarmed. The Fed is operating under a theory that it should accommodate the needs of trade, but now they decide that they've overdone it. They start to tighten money, and the boom comes to an end. It's not the stock market that brings the boom to an end. The stock market crash is actually after the real economy turns down. So production peaks in about the middle of 1929. The stock market crashes in October. And it's a big crash. GDP falls 26.5% over the next 4 years. Industrial production, because it was expanded disproportionately, falls disproportionately. It's cut almost in half. So why is that? Well, you've heard the Austrian theory of the business cycle. There was disproportionality in production introduced by unwarranted credit expansion. So how do economists explain the crash and the depression? Well, time for another myth. Same article by Krugman. This article, by the way, is just a never-ending font of things that you can make fun of. He's got a critique of Milton Friedman, which is just breathtaking.
Isn't that Krugman's career?
It has become Krugman's career. So here's his view of the state of the economics profession. Classical economics, and he's adopting Keynes's terminology, where classical means before Keynes, offered neither explanations nor solutions for the Great Depression, right? Because they were mired in this orthodoxy. By the middle of the 1930s, the challenges to orthodoxy could no longer be contained, right? So you have this picture of economists as a group have no explanation for the crash, and they're trying to suppress anybody who does, but finally they lose their grip. Well, look, there are lots of economists who are not blissfully ignorant of the fact that there's a depression out the window, and they're trying to explain it. Mises, Hayek, and Robbins actually started to explain that a crash was coming before the crash actually arrived. In Great Britain, Dennis Robertson, whose name Roger Garrison mentioned, Hawtrey, Pigou have theories of why the economy has fallen into this deep pit. In the U.S., Irving Fisher offers a kind of monetary explanation. So there are lots of explanations out there. Now, if you're a Keynesian, you might not like them, but you shouldn't say that the economics is not offering any explanations. And these guys all have policy proposals too, so it's not that they were at a loss for suggesting what should be done. Here's the view of the Austrians that has become kind of the mainstream view. I published an article last year in the Journal of Muddy Credit and Banking with the title, Did Hayek and Robbins Deepen the Great Depression? Which sounds like a ridiculous question until you discover that they've actually been accused of it. Right? The accusation is they gave bad policy advice, governments took it, and that's why the Depression became so deep. And although I dearly love Milton Friedman in other respects, some other respects, not here, not as an intellectual historian of this question, he gives an interview to Gene Epstein of Barron's in 1999 in which he says, I think the Austrian business cycle theory has done the world a great deal of harm. You had Hayek and Lionel Robbins saying, you just have to let the bottom drop out of the world. You've just got to let it cure itself. You can't do anything about it. You'll only make it worse. I think by encouraging that kind of do-nothing policy, both in Britain and the United States, they did harm. So Friedman's view was the economy was doing great, and then for no fault of policy, the crash began, and the money supply began to contract, and that caused problems. But so the solution was keep the money supply from contracting, and if you had done that, there wouldn't have been any problem at all. Whereas Hayek and Robbins were saying, no, let the money supply contract. An economist at Berkeley named Brad DeLong, some of you might have seen his blog, has developed this charge at greater length, referring to economists who want to let failing firms fail as liquidationists, and linking that to the idea that there's no damage done by a 30% shrinkage in the money supply, and so he tars them all with this brush of liquidationism. I think these charges are unfair, and if you read what Hayek says in Prices and Production about what a central bank should do in the second best world of a fiat money standard, right? What advice could we give to the central bank to minimize the harm they do? He says, well, they should stabilize nominal spending. In the equation of exchange, that's M times V, so the stock of money times the rate at which it turns over. And as the equation of exchange tells us, aggregate spending is the same as aggregate income. One person's spending is another person's income. So that's the same as stabilizing nominal GDP. So the advice then is, if the money supply starts to drop because of a scramble for liquidity in a fractional reserve banking system, the central bank ought to prevent that by, if people want to hold more base money, provide more base money. And if velocity starts to drop, if people want to hoard the money that exists, offset that by increasing the money supply. Now, Hayek didn't push this. I mean, there is a germ of truth in this charge against him. He didn't push this when it really mattered. He had this idea that prices and wages were too inflexible, and if we have a short, sharp shock, as we did in 1921, we can restore flexibility, and then we'll have a rapid recovery again. He later said, I should have realized that that wasn't going to happen, that that was the wrong way to go about it. But he emphasized later, and I think rightly, that, look, it wasn't my theory that was at fault. I don't have to change my theoretical view. My theoretical view always was that there's no good served by letting nominal demand collapse because of instability in the money supply or instability in velocity. But the notion that, so there's two things wrong with the notion that Hayek influenced policymakers. One, if he had influenced them, they would have taken a different policy than they did. And secondly, there's no evidence that he influenced them, and it would be kind of odd for a book published in 1931 to have influenced policymaking in 1930. Which is basically what DeLong thinks happened. In my article, I look into what Hoover himself believed, and Hoover's not a liquidationist either, in the sense of, well, how did Friedman put it, sitting by and letting the bottom drop out. Hoover believed in intervening at the first opportunity. And Rothbard, sort of the second half of America's Great Depression, is a catalog of the programs that Hoover instituted. It gets better, but I think I'll have to spare you the details of the way in which DeLong's picture of the intellectual debate is off the mark. The reason the Fed was acquiescing in the contraction of the money supply is not that they were reading Hayek, but they were adherents of something called the real bills doctrine. What I referred to earlier as the idea that they should satisfy the legitimate needs of of trade, or the demands of commerce for credit. And, you know, in 1932, there wasn't much demand for credit. Business was depressed, and so interest rates were actually pretty low. And of course, when you're in a vicious deflation, the fact that prices are falling is going to mean that people will lend money at low interest rates because they're going to be paid back in dollars that buy a lot more than the dollars they lend. So by failing to distinguish between nominal rates and real rates, and by looking at credit market conditions rather than at the supply and demand for money, the Fed didn't think they needed to do anything. Okay, so we get the Great Depression. Hoover, despite his activism, gets kicked out of office. FDR comes in. Here's FDR's first inaugural, and see if this puzzles you as much as it puzzled me the first time I read it. This is 1932, right? This is the low point of the Great Depression. Plenty is at our doorstep. What? But a generous use of it languishes in the very sight of the supply. So, right, we got warehouses bulging with goods, but for some reason they're not being consumed. This is because the rulers of the exchange of mankind's goods have failed through their own stubbornnness and their own incompetence, have admitted their failure, and have abdicated. Have abdicated? So apparently they've left the field and are welcoming in with hosannas the federal government's takeover of the economy. But it's the first part that's really baffling. Plenty is at our doorstep. And the idea here is that government can restore prosperity if it will manage the supply of goods. Right? So the idea is that goods are kind of choking the market with their abundance. And the way to restore prosperity is to better manage production and distribution. And consistent with that diagnosis, the first programs of the Roosevelt administration are the National Recovery Administration and the Agricultural Adjustment Act. The NRA, established by the National Industrial Recovery Act, the NIRA, establishes a system of basically cartels, boards that will, for each industry, dictate how much to produce and which firms get to produce what shares, how many people they're allowed to hire, what prices they're allowed to charge, what wages they have to pay, and how they're supposed to distribute the output. Well, if you want to contract output, this is a good way to do it, right? Because the first thing a cartel wants to do is get monopoly prices for its members, and that means restricting output. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, same program in industry. Here's one of their, agriculture. Here's one of their posters. There's a surplus of cotton. Reduce your crop now. Right? So we're in the middle of a depression, and farmers are being told, grow less. Now, you know, if you take just one industry, if you take just, say, the production of pork, it can be the case that so much pork is produced that the price falls so far, if the demand is relatively inelastic, to clear the market, the price has to fall a long way. It can be the case that pork growers then can't cover their costs. So in a single market, this makes a certain amount of sense, that you can restore profitability by cutting output. If everybody agrees to share the cutback in output, everybody can produce pork more profitably. Right? But it can't be the case for the economy as a whole that everybody can become more prosperous by cutting back output. And it doesn't add up. It's a fallacy of composition. And if everybody tries to get a bigger share of the pie by cutting back output, all you get is a smaller pie. And everybody ends up with a share of a smaller pie. But that was the program. We paid farmers not to grow. The government actually bought crops and destroyed them or gave them away to people who couldn't afford them otherwise. In 1933, they slaughtered 6 million pigs. So in the middle of an economic depression where people are going hungry, let's reduce the pork supply. There are photographs you can find of farmers pouring milk down the drain. Where did these ideas come from? They came from the Brain Trust, and in particular from a guy named Rexford Tugwell. And Rexford Tugwell's name, of course, was taken from an Ayn Rand novel. So he's the intellectual. He's an economics professor at Columbia University. Columbia is in New York City. Roosevelt was governor of New York State, And so when he was governor, he assembled a kind of group of advisors, and when he ran for president, they became his brain trust. They became the people who fed him with ideas that got into his campaign, and who became members of his administration when he was elected. So here's a photo with Roosevelt on the right, Tugwell in the middle. Here's Tugwell and Adolf Berle, who was the guy who assembled the brain trust. So I have a lot in this chapter, chapter 4, about Tugwell and where he got his ideas. So the history of thought I'm sort of telling in flashbacks, which is not the usual way to do it. Usually, history of economic thought textbook will begin with Aristotle and sort of move forward by centuries. I'm telling it in flashbacks, and sometimes telling a story in flashbacks is the best way to tell it. And in the foreword to the book, I explain this principle and quote Quentin Tarantino as my authority. Tugwell is quite explicit about what he's proposing. He's got a book which basically outlines the National Recovery Act, National Recovery Administration kind of plan that we should have industry by industry cartels. He's got an article in the AER in 1932, another one of those anti-laissez-faire economists being suppressed before Keynes comes along. He got his ideas from a group of economists known as institutionalists. Thorstein Veblen, probably the most famous among them. But the institutionalists, like Ely was another one, got their ideas from the German historical school. And they were explicitly anti-laissez-faire. So they brought these ideas to the U.S., combined them with some other things. In Tugwell's case, his theory of the Depression comes from Hobson. And Hobson had basically taken the Marxist theory that workers aren't paid the full value of their product and said, oh, well, that gives us an explanation of depressions. Depressions arise because workers, not being paid the full value of their product, can't buy back all the products. So products go unsold. Hence depression. This is a theory, of course, that makes it impossible to explain why there should ever be a prosperity. So it's a theory you never hear when the economy is doing well. It's only trotted out when the economy is depressed. But Tugwell takes it from Hobson, and later in his memoirs he says, people think I got this idea from Keynes. Nonsense. I got it from Hobson. I had it before Keynes. But the overproduction theory is basically the same as Keynes's underconsumption theory. Right? They're two sides of the same coin. There's another thing influencing Tugwell and helps to explain FDR's remark that plenty is at our doorstep, and that was the idea that modern management methods introduced by Taylor, so it's sometimes called Taylorism. Taylor's the guy who held a stopwatch on the workers and figured out how to redesign their motions so as to waste less time. That convinced Tugwell that the world is going to be awash in goods, and so we need to manage this flood of goods so it doesn't choke our markets. Now, who did he think was doing a better job than the market economy at managing this? Well, he visited the Soviet Union in the 20s and came away very impressed. He was sad that he missed his chance to meet with Stalin. He was off visiting some farm at the time. And in the 30s, while he's a Roosevelt administration official, he goes to Italy to meet Mussolini. And he does meet Mussolini, and he writes in his diary about how inspiring Italian fascism is. You know, they've really got a hold on how to manage the economy. So there you have it. The most recent legacy of institutionalism is the writing of John Kenneth Galbraith, who basically steals all his ideas from the earlier institutionalists. You can trace them book by book. But Galbraith keeps popping up in my history of the 20th century. And every time he's on the spot at the important debates giving precisely the wrong advice. So during the Second World War, he's a price control czar and writes about what a great idea price controls are. He's sent to Germany to advise on the post-war German reconstruction, and he says, oh, decontrol of the economy will never work. There's no question we got to plan the economy. People who think that decontrolling prices is going to help the economy recover, right? That's ludicrous. He turns out to be wrong about that. Then he goes to India. In fact, he's ambassador to India under JFK, and he says, oh, well, there's no question we need government planning on the Soviet model to advance the economy. It won't, if you leave it to the market, nothing will happen. Well, India didn't leave it to the market. Government took over the planning, and nothing happened, right? No growth. Well, back to the Great Depression. The economy begins to recover after 1933, but there's an important backsliding period from 37 to 38. Monetary policy tightened. Industrial production fell by a third. And really, it's at that point that Keynes's message begins to get traction. Because while the economy was recovering, why would you adopt a theory that says the economy will get stuck permanently in a Great Depression? But when the economy starts to backslide, young economists say, oh, well, what's going on here? They pick up Keynes's book and begin to spread the new gospel. But the lingering of the Great Depression is due to a sort of perfect storm of bad economic policies. There's a book with a title very much like that. What's the title of Ferguson's book? A Policy Disaster of International Proportions, or something like that. There's the Smoot-Hawley tariff, there are tax hikes, there's the Reconstruction Finance Corporation that Hoover begins. Basically, see if this sounds familiar. If firms are failing, then the government ought to give them loans to keep them in business. Right, so let's perpetuate the bad investments. Let's not sort things out. Hoover brings businessmen into the White House and says, whatever you do, don't cut wages. Because if you cut wages, you'll reduce the workers' purchasing power, and that'll make the economy go down the tubes. Well, it apparently never occurred to him that it's better to reduce wages and employ more people than to keep wages high and lay people off in massive quantities. But FDR gives federal government force of law to this idea in the National Labor Relations Act. Don't cut wages, pay prevailing union wages. We've got the restriction in output from the NRA and the AAA, and we've got an unmitigated monetary contraction. So Keynes's reaction is to say, the economy's trapped in a vicious circle. There's too little investment, there's too much saving. That perpetuates low income, and out of low income, there's not going to be enough inducement to invest. So the government's got to step in and come to the rescue. And he begins to develop this view as early as 1930 and eventually writes it up for the benefit of his fellow economists in the general theory. And the contrast to Hayek's view you've already heard a lot about. Hayek's view is that, no, things were not peachy keen in 1929. There were inner contradictions that made it inevitable that the boom would collapse. And the thing to do in the Depression is to let insolvent firms fail, because resources need to be reallocated from inappropriate activities, in particular in the earliest stages of production, to more appropriate, more sustainable activities in other lines of production. And in that sense, Hayek believed in liquidation. Yeah, liquidate insolvent firms, let the market reallocate the resources, but not in the sense of letting aggregate demand collapse. But Keynes had this idea that, the economy's not going to right itself, because if people are spending, then there's no demand for goods. He didn't have any idea that there was intertemporal coordination through the market for loanable funds. Those who think in this way are deceived. They're supposing there's a nexus which unites decisions to abstain from present consumption with decisions to provide for future consumption. Yeah. It's called the market for loanable funds, or the intertemporal market, or financial markets. And there's something called an interest rate that plays the role of coordinating savings with investment. And Hayek is kind of flabbergasted when he writes The Pure Theory of Capital. Keynes never seems to have reflected on the function of the interest rate. But Keynes's theory caught on because it provided a kind of optimism, a kind of activism. Young economists wanted to be policy advisors. This gave them something to do, rather than say, well, let the economy sort it out. Hayek and Robbins had what Friedman described as a very gloomy view. Did Keynesian policy end the Depression? Right? Galbraith certainly believed that. But there's another view, and Bob Higgs has written quite a bit about this. No. The economy recovers when we finally dismantle the New Deal programs and dismantle the price controls of World War II. And the fact that they drafted people into the army, yeah, it reduced unemployment, but that's not prosperity. The spending didn't actually help. It doesn't actually help capital formation to produce bombs and blow them up. Right? Then you're left with nothing. Over in Europe, I'm just going to go at whatever pace I'm on, and we'll end whenever we end. Probably not going to get to the present. Is there an alternative economic system which is being implemented in Italy and Germany? Well, not really. There really isn't any theory that's trying to be implemented in the way the Bolsheviks had some notion of a centrally planned economy. Germany and Italy kind of stumble into a centrally a command economy, a centrally administered economy. And Wilhelm Röpke, a German economist, who heroically stays in Germany throughout the war. No, sorry, take that back. He has to flee to Turkey because he gives speeches denouncing Nazism after the Nazis are elected. And he's visited by SS agents who politely suggest, not so politely, who suggest to him that he better get on board with their program. And he says, no thanks. And then he says, after the SS agents leave, he says in his memoirs, it occurred to me that I'd probably better leave the country after that, right? Because he tells them to get lost. But he writes an article about what he calls fascist economics. So grouping together Mussolini and Hitler. He says, I've looked for the theory and there's no theory. One might be tempted to dismiss it as economic Dadaism. If you haven't heard of Dadaism, Dadaism is an art movement which proclaims that there are no principles of art. So the artist can do whatever the hell he wants. The Dadaists at least had a sense of humor. So they produced these sort of absurdist, funny artwork. They at least had a sense of humor. Not so much the Nazis. And Röpke says they're proud of this lack of an coherent intellectual theory. They sail along with a minimum of intellectual freight and are proud of it. So they know they're against capitalism, but they're also against Bolshevism, so they don't want any revolutionary changes. So what you get is interventionism plus a kind of nationalistic, collectivist phraseology. So what happens under this interventionism? Well, you get an outcome that nobody really intended at the beginning. This is Oiken's analysis. They try to implement a full employment policy. They start building the autobahns, for example. And it's all financed with cheap credit, but then inflation starts to take off. They've been through the hyperinflation in the 1920s. They can't allow that, so they slap on price controls. Well, price controls give you shortages. Shortages mean you have to ration goods. And you could either ration them through the black market. Well, if you're going to have price controls, they give people ration coupons. They prohibit black market trading. But of course, there is a lot of black market trading, a lot of barter. The government, there's a shortage of foreign exchange, so the government starts directing foreign trade. There are shortages of coal, iron, and cement, so they start allocating them to where they think they're the most important. They start giving factories production quotas. They start saying this is more important than that. And when rearmament begins, this all intensifies because they want to direct resources to the armament factories. So this is basically the actual case that inspires Mises' theory of interventionism. Right? Middle of the road leads to socialism. Other essays in his book, Planning for Freedom. Mises is, again, not just theorizing on a blackboard, but reacting to events in the economy. So there is an interventionist dynamic that leads in a sort of logical way. There is a causal sequence that leads to the centrally planned economy, but it's not the imposition of an ideology. or it's not the direct imposition of an ideology. The ideology leads to it indirectly and unintentionally. Well, in the democracies, in the U.S. and in Great Britain, they also begin planning the economy to fight the war. They commandeer factories. And the socialists say, well, look, this worked. We won the war, so let's continue to plan for peace the way we planned for war. What's good in war is good in peace. This cartoon is from the cartoon version of The Road to Serfdom, which if you haven't seen, it's available on the IEA website. It's quite amusing. And if you're giving a lecture, it makes for good cartoon slides. The Labour Party, and Bruce Caldwell quotes from this in his excellent introduction to the new edition of The Road to Serfdom, which I recommend, is that, look, Hayek is up against an predominant viewpoint that this is the rational way to proceed. The Labour Party in the UK says, let's not return to the unplanned competitive world of the interwar years. As we know, under that system, the rich got richer and the poor got poorer. We need to retain the wartime controls to avoid the scramble for profits which followed the last war. Oh, how horrendous. Businesses were trying to make profits and avoid losses. They actually solicit a study of what happened after the First World War and why there was such inflation. And the economist who writes it for them and says, oh, well, it was a mistake to decontrol prices so rapidly after the First World War. That's what led to inflation. What was happening to the quantity of money? The economist who wrote this piece for the Labour Party was Pigou. Right? Pigou, who Keynes attacked as being a reactionary, was providing ideas to the Labour Party, which wanted to plan the economy and nationalize everything. In the U.S., here's Alvin Hansen, who was one of the early spreaders of the Keynesian doctrine, but was himself a student of the institutionalists. It's not possible to go back to the atomistic order. It's not an option. We don't have a choice between plan and no plan. Our only choice is between democratic planning and totalitarian regimentation. So that was the way the debate was being framed. And so that's the context in which The Road to Serfdom is written, as a warning that, hey, wait a minute, if you try to plan the economy even with the best intentions, you'll end up with the worst of systems, with the worst people on top. And the book actually began as Hayek's supervisor, dean at the LSE, a guy named Beveridge, who was an arch Labourite, Fabian socialist, had this view that National Socialism was an arch-capitalist doctrine. It was a reactionary doctrine meant to defend capitalism. Yeah, that's why they called it National Socialism. And he said, no, Hayek says, no, look at their ideas. They're anti-capitalist, and they arise from the socialist trends of the preceding period. They're not a reaction to those trends. It's sort of an amplification of Bismarckian socialism with a nationalist element. It's not a reaction against that. And from the memo, it became a journal article, and then a pamphlet, and then finally a book. So I think we're running short on time, so I will end there. Of course, the rest of the century is one where The Road to Serfdom helps inspire a counter-movement. Hayek founds the Mont Pelerin Society. The ideas of Adam Smith are revived, and the battle for the market begins to take a slightly better turn. If you watch the Commanding Heights documentary, the first disc of the 3-disc set, you get a kind of dramatization of it, which was, of course, released before the current financial crisis. So actually I started this project as an attempt to sort of retell the story that the Commanding Heights tells, but with some intellectual content, with some tracing of the ideas back to their sources. And some people who found out I was working on this said, you're beating a dead horse. This is a year and a half ago. You're beating a dead horse arguing about capitalism versus socialism. talking about nationalization of industry. Nobody believes in that anymore. Yeah, unfortunately, not true. Okay, so thanks, and I will take questions. Yeah.
You mentioned that Hayek suggested that when you have a contraction of the money supply at the beginning of a depression, that perhaps you should infuse the money, the system with money at that point.
Right.
Did he make a suggestion on how to get that out? And then secondly, weren't most Austrians really in favor of kind of just letting the whole thing correct itself?
Okay, so how did Hayek propose to keep the money supply from collapsing? How did he propose to inject new money? And weren't most Austrians in favor of letting things collapse?
And how did he say anything about getting the money out, like we have the problem right now?
No, actually, because Hayek at the time seemed to be relatively indifferent to what was known as the secondary contraction, he was actually criticized from the other side. People like Haberler in particular said, we need to worry about the fact that the money supply is collapsing, the supply of credit is collapsing because the banking system is collapsing. And in order to prevent this crushing deflation where people are trying to restore their money holdings and therefore are not spending and therefore goods can't be sold, won't be able to be sold until the prices all adjust. Yeah, eventually that will happen, but it would be easier and less painful to, if people want to hold more money, provide them with more money. So Hayek was criticized at the time for not embracing his own policy norm, for not calling for the central bank to take active measures to prevent the money supply from continuing to shrink, which logically Hayek should have done if he believed in his own norm of stabilizing MV. So the way you prevent the money supply from collapsing is open market operations. Right? Have the central bank buy government bonds. But there's a sense in which Austrians were and should be favor of letting the market sort things out, and that is, don't try to pick winners, don't try to prop open insolvent companies. Let the market sort that out. But given the second best world we're in, where the control of the money supply comes from the central bank, and the only place that more basic money can be had, because we've short-circuited the gold standard, is the central bank. Have the central bank, in a sense, replicate what a gold standard would have done in providing more money when there's an increased demand to hold money.
So, like, if the gold standard were in place, people would melt down gold and things like that to get more money to buy things in that type of a difficult situation. So it would naturally expand the supply of money.
Right. So under a gold standard, in any one country where there's an increased demand for gold, they can import gold from the rest of the world. And in the long run, gold mines can produce more gold to satisfy the demand. Hayek was actually critical of the gold standard for not responding quickly enough to an increase in the demand for money. But if people are willing to use bank-issued money, then banks in a free banking system can step up and provide money more promptly, provided people want to hold it and not spend it. So it's not going to depreciate the value of money if people want to hold it, and it's not going to endanger the safety of the banks because it's not going to pose a threat to the reserves they do have. So the banks can create more bank-issued money on the basis of a given gold reserve if people want to hold the money, if people want to hoard the money. When people start to spend it, then the bank has to scale back. In our current environment, well, I'll talk more about that this afternoon, we have the problem that the central bank has injected lots of credit, not through open market operations, but through stranger means. But does it realize that it needs to pull it back when it starts to be spent? Yeah.
What do you think caused the recession of 1921?
It's basically a post-war recession. It's, during World War I, there's a great expansion of credit by the Federal Reserve. Pumps up prices sort of beyond a sustainable level, and so a correction was going to come. So it's the collapse of a credit boom, basically. Under the gold standard, there is a role for, once you've had a credit expansion, for a contraction to a certain extent. Right? There's a certain sustainable level of bank liabilities, a certain ratio, if you like, of bank liabilities to gold. And if you go beyond that, then yes, you have to contract. So there is a correction that's necessary, and Hayek's prescription is not try to maintain the largest volume of NV that has ever been achieved. Right? Don't try to stay at the peak of the boom forever, but rather find the sustainable level. Right? So at that point, there's no need to go contract any further. So there is a role for a correction, but you don't want to overdo it. You don't need a secondary contraction on top of that. Here's the way Mises put it. Right? If you've had an inflation, it's like you've run over somebody in a car. You don't make him better off by putting the car in reverse and running over him in the other direction by having a vicious deflation. Yeah?
In the recession of 1921 that you're discussing, what did the Federal Reserve's monetary policy look like in the wake of that? If it was essentially self-correcting, it would seem they pretty much followed the right policy. What was that?
Yeah,
how does it square with monetary equilibrium theory?
Well, they did very little. So the money supply had been overexpanded relative to what was sustainable under the gold standard, and they let it correct itself. And it did put downward pressure on prices, but it didn't overshoot into a collapse. Right? There weren't runs on the banks. And so this is why I made the distinction. There's a certain amount of correction, a certain amount of credit contraction, if you like, to repeal the overexpansion that took place previously, and they basically let that happen. Meanwhile, the government took off the price controls that had been hampering the economy, and so they let things recover. Tom Woods discusses this at the beginning of his book on Meltdown, and I think it is a good example of how the economy can correct itself, why recessions back in the old days didn't last as long as the Great Depression.
The title of that book's Meltdown.
Meltdown. Yeah.
How do you feel about the stagflation of the 1970s?
I'm against it. So the question was, how do you feel about the stagflation of the 70s? What do you mean, how do I feel about it?
The failure of that it completely demolished any Keynesian ideas at the time.
Yeah.
Especially in light of the failure of Brand.
Right, so the stagflation of the 1970s was something that wasn't supposed to happen under the Keynesian economics of the day, because not having a theory of inflation, their theory of inflation became the Phillips curve, which basically said if you have a tight labor market, low unemployment, that'll start to bid up wages. Those rising costs will start to push up prices. And if you have a slack labor market, high unemployment, then wages won't rise, and so prices won't rise. So low unemployment goes with rising prices, high unemployment goes with low inflation. I wish I'd brought those slides with me. If you look at the Phillips curve, if you plot inflation and unemployment in the 60s, it does look like all the points are sort of lined up in that way. But if you look again, you notice that if you date the points by year, that we're moving up the curve, inflation is rising, and after 1969 it all goes kerblooey. The points in the early 70s are way off that original Phillips curve, and how could that be if you had this trade-off between inflation and unemployment? And I shouldn't fail to mention that in 1969, Samuelson and Solow published an article saying, here's our trade-off between inflation and unemployment. This is what policymakers fixed. This is their menu of options. And wise policy consists of picking the best point on this fixed trade-off we're faced with. and the trade-off disappears. So yes, it was a crisis in Keynesian economics, and the chapter I'm writing now is the economics profession's reaction to that, which is basically to rediscover the quantity theory, and that rediscovery is called monetarism. Unfortunately, there's not so much rediscovery of the virtues of the gold standard, but monetarism says, look, you need to manage the quantity of money under a fiat standard if you want to avoid inflation. And unemployment is, in the long run, independent of the inflation rate because right, it's a real phenomenon. It's not just a pricing phenomenon. So, yeah, the stagflation revealed the sort of hollowness of the Keynesian model, and Keynesians have been scrambling ever since to reconstruct a version of Keynesian economics that can accommodate that kind of event. Yeah.
One, are you seeing any bubbles forming now? And two, do you plan your investment strategy according to your understanding of the Austrian business cycle and markets according to Austrian economics?
Okay, do I see a bubble forming now, and what's my investment advice? I'm going to defer that question to this afternoon because I'm going to talk about the current crisis, and I'm going to talk about the current policy response to the crisis and what's building up now. But yeah,
Your portfolio?
the answer is the answer to the first question is yes. I mean, monetary policy is now making the same mistakes that it made in 2001 of overreacting, keeping interest rates too low too long. Yeah.
We saw the first part of the story in the Soviet Union about the recession just after the revolution. But as far as I know, there was also a period of boom, for example, after the Second World War. I want to know if it was a real period of boom or they were just fake statistics by the Soviet Union. And in that case, how was that possible? Under a central planning economy.
Okay, so the question is, the Soviet Union reported a period of vigorous economic growth after the Second World War. And did this actually happen, and if so, how? And the answer is no, it didn't really happen. They ginned up the statistics. I mean, there may have been, I don't know I'm not a Sovietologist, I'm not sure what the current revised best estimates we have of output are. It may be that from the completely depressed state of the Soviet economy, it became a little less depressed. It may be that the black markets were allowed to function more effectively and Western prices were used more effectively to try to steer the economy. But basically, they were faking the statistics, we now know. And it's amusing to follow the progress of the Soviet economy in Paul Samuelson's textbooks. Right? Up to the fall of the Berlin Wall, his textbooks are saying, well, this shows that Hayek was wrong, that a centrally planned economy can grow vigorously by planning enough investment. Right? And because our growth models tell us that if you have enough investment, you can grow rapidly. Then after the Berlin Wall falls, suddenly the Soviet experiment is the failed experiment. But yeah, we now know that the data that the Soviets were putting out were falsified. So exactly what the correct numbers look like, I'm not sure. There may have been periods of bad growth and periods of less bad growth. Yeah.
So you mentioned that during the 20s when sort of the production triangle was elongating, there was a period without this nominal price increase.
Well, consumer prices were not rising, right.
Okay. So I guess my question is if
Producer prices were rising.
so if more resources are being diverted towards producer products and away from consumer products, how could it happen that consumer prices would not rise?
Okay, so the question is, in an Austrian-type boom like the 1920s, how could, if resources are being diverted to the early stages of production, how is it that output of consumer goods continues to grow? Well, I think Roger Garrison gave you the answer that both ends of the triangle are pulling against the middle. Consumers are saving less and spending more, and so the output of consumer goods is not suffering at the expense of early stages. Early stages are growing, consumer spending is growing. You're temporarily outside the production possibility frontier. So how can you produce more of everything? Well, unemployment goes down, people work longer hours, you work overtime, old machines are brought back into use. It makes sense for an entrepreneur to do that at an individual factory if there's an increase in demand for his stuff. But if everybody thinks that there's a relative increase in demand for his stuff, they're collectively mistaken. Well, I think it's time for our break, so thank you very much.